going to cover today is just a brief journey through the knowledge management landscape, touching on where it's relevant and critical for competitive intelligence, in particular given my assertion that most of what we need to know is already within the organisation. What are those aspects of knowledge management, or KM as I'll call it, that really impact the CI function? What is it that we can do as CI or KM practitioners that promote business success, whether it's through some systems, some processes or tools, relating back to knowledge, what we already know within the organisation? We'll cover off a few definitions of knowledge management. We'll spend a few seconds just touching on the unknown unknowns. We'll talk about IT solutions, and I have some important messages there to cover off, particularly why they are not necessarily as good as they might appear. And the feature for today's webinar will be around avoiding loss of critical knowledge, because there is really so much in our organisations that we can capitalise on. So I'm going to begin our journey just by reflecting on some incidents that happened a little over 10, 12 years ago. Just four disasters, one natural disaster, 3 man-made. The common element running through all of these, whether they are explosions of some kind or hurricanes or anything like that, a lot of knowledge was known in advance of all of these events. In the Space Shuttle Columbia, for example, scenarios were worked through. The people, the engineers, the scientists and the technicians behind the Space Shuttle Columbia mission knew pretty much everything there was to know about launching the shuttle, about bringing it back safely. Still, on re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, it exploded. Something happened. In the case of Hurricane Katrina, a lot of scenarios had been worked through many, many years in advance, because hurricanes are a regular occurrence in that part of the world. Still, when the hurricane happened, it was felt that organisations, agencies weren't prepared in the aftermath of the hurricane. Perhaps organisations could have been better organised. And in the case of the Toulouse fertiliser explosion and the Buncefield fire, again, a lot of detail was known, but accidents happened and the organisations felt unprepared for this. The theme running through all of these situations is that there were unknown unknowns. There were lessons that weren't learned. There was knowledge shared within the organisation, but not between the relevant communities. Did know, but they weren't connecting. The agencies weren't connecting. They weren't capitalising on what they already knew. From the CI perspective, some commentators have written a lot about many of these incidents, particularly Hurricane Katrina. And so I'm sharing one person's take on that. But the parallels in knowledge management are very, very good here. Just to take a few as examples, we can see in the case of organisations not learning from what they've done in the past. So many organisations do have lessons learned capabilities. They have grand databases, but do they really learn from what's happened in the past? A lot of organisations have lots of documentation, but what if the information or the experiences aren't effectively documented? A lot of organisations have great bunches of scientists doing really interesting things, but what if they fail to join up those communities of experts so the right people are not talking at the right time to share critical know-how, critical knowledge? What about bringing in fresh ideas and avoiding the challenge of groupthink? It's all very easy to make decisions when you've made that decision 20 or 30 times in the past. But what if the situation has changed? And what about this big challenge we've got of investing in grand processes, systems galore, but creating too much complexity? So we're overlooking the opportunities afforded by informal conversation, informal corridor chats, or as the graphic on the front page illustrated, the water cooler moments. So just to put a few quick definitions, I won't go into these in any great detail, but people talk about knowledge management as something to do with intangible assets. It's something that you can't really pick up. People talk about communities within organizations. They talk about knowledge being the most important asset, knowledge and people. They talk about assets making things possible, people making things happen. And then they say knowledge management is maybe 10% technology, but 90% people. So what is it that's common in all of this? Well, if we lay upon this a very traditional view of knowledge management, that is to say people, process, technology and content, this quadrant has been around for maybe 15 or even 20 years. Each of these in isolation is important for knowledge management, as indeed it probably is in the field of competitive intelligence. But organizations that succeed in utilizing their knowledge, in building on what they already know, they don't depend significantly on technology. Technology is an enabler. It's not the end in itself. Content, of course, is specific to the organization. It's specific to the context. What really matters in these organizations where knowledge management or knowledge working has really helped the organizations is the people. It's the brains, the intellect, the common experiences of those people, and it's the processes through which that knowledge can be shared. So looking at that in a slightly different way, we can apply two perspectives. One is the knowledge cycle, and the other, which you're probably already familiar with, the intelligence cycle. There are several striking similarities between these two cycles, and I think these will help to understand today's webinar as we reflect on why knowledge is so important in our organizations. For example, we talk about collecting information on or intelligence in CI. In knowledge management, we talk about eliciting or extracting, getting the knowledge, getting the information. We talk about processing or consolidating and organizing knowledge, information. We talk about analyzing and synthesizing, and then we talk about packaging, sharing, disseminating. These are relative metaphors for each other. They are almost synonymous. So in the competitive intelligence cycle, we could almost be doing knowledge management, but there are some peculiarities of KM that I want to amplify today and help you think more logically through why knowledge, internal knowledge, is critical for your competitive intelligence function. First of all, a quick definition. What is knowledge? Those of you in the United Kingdom will probably be familiar with this cliche of a taxi driver in London. The knowledge he has is pure tacit knowledge. It's knowing how to get from A to B or A to Z, avoiding traffic jams, avoiding the rush hour, avoiding things that are happening on particular days. The taxi driver has learned through experience over a number of years that real knowledge, it's not just looking up in the atlas how to get from A to Z, it's knowing. That's tacit knowledge which only the taxi driver has. I drive through London, but I simply don't have the same quantity or appreciation of tacit knowledge that a taxi driver has. Another way of looking at this is to compare knowledge with the constituent parts of it. So we talk about stuff that's in databases, in systems, as being data or information. Out of context, it doesn't really have very much value. As we apply context and meaning to content from databases or systems, we start to gain a little bit of knowledge. As we apply our own view on content from systems, as we apply our own view on data from reports or things that we are told, we start to create knowledge, we create understanding. There is, as we go up this pyramid, an increasing value in what we can do with the content that we've created, with what we've created in our organizations. And as we go beyond real knowledge, we start to turn into wisdom or intelligence. The terminology we use is interchangeable, but fundamentally what I'm trying to present here is a continuum from the relatively less useful data in isolation through to something that can be truly, truly valuable in the right context with the insight. And the parallel in competitive intelligence circles is to turn competitor information into actionable intelligence. There is that difference. And my challenge to all of us is, how do we, in our own organizational context, turn data and information, of which there is a lot, into knowledge, and how do we exploit that knowledge? So where is this stuff? Well, the things in systems and databases, the sort of stuff that we gather in competitor reports, analysts' reports, and so on, that's explicit knowledge. We have no shortage of that, whether it's documentation, it's reports, standards, processes, and so on. The nice thing with that is that we can organize it efficiently. We can create databases with really good metadata. We can create instantly accessible information at the touch of a button. But that's only a part of what's in our organization. The stuff we can't see, the tacit knowledge, is the stuff that's inside our heads. It's the know-how and the know-why. So we can describe how we did something 10 years ago. We can also describe why we did something 10 years ago. Why was the decision made? That's real know-how and know-why. The tacit knowledge, though, is difficult to get to. It's very difficult to manage. In fact, some people say it's impossible to manage. I think we can do something with that knowledge. I think we can create processes to get closer towards the knowledge. We can exploit the content in people's heads by bringing the people together. And we'll have a look at a few of those tools and techniques in just a few moments. But what's really challenging for us is the stuff that's truly hidden. These are the unknown unknowns. And I put it to you that your organization has so many of these unknown unknowns that in themselves could yield so many answers to the technical questions you've got, to the strategic challenges you've got. So this guy, Donald Rumsfeld, he was ridiculed some decade or so ago when he talked about the unknown unknowns. He actually had something sensible to say, and in a way I wish we paid some attention to this comment of his. He talked about the things that we know we know. Of course, there is a lot of stuff that we have ready access to. We can look it up on databases on the internet, in our organizations. It's filed away nicely. That's all very good. Then there are things that we know we don't know, so we need to do something about that. We recognize it. But what Donald Rumsfeld was saying is that there are things that are unknown to us. We just don't know what those things are. These pretty much are critical to future success. They are critical to avoiding risk, to avoiding catastrophe or disaster. Because if we simply don't know what these things are, how can we anticipate? Well, there are some things we can do. Let's look at this from a slightly different perspective. We know in the top right corner of this quadrant that there are things that we know. We know. We should exploit those for organizational efficiency, for compliance purposes. We don't need to talk about that. There are plenty of systems and databases to help us do that. Then there are things that we know we don't know. So we target those, we explore them, we focus on them at the right time. We create the content, we make sure that content is effectively synthesized, understood, filed and shared and so on. It becomes something that we know we know. It moves into the certainty quadrant. And then there are things that we don't know we know. This, I guess, goes back to the root of this webinar, that 80% of what we need to know is already in the organization, but if only we knew how to find it, if only we knew we had it. And then in the bottom left-hand corner, there are the things we simply do not know that our organisation knows, whether that's individual people or it's collective people, in other words, communities of practice, let's call them. How do we focus on what we really don't know? Systems and technologies help us with the top right-hand quadrant, the stuff that we can see, it's tangible, we can manipulate it in systems and so on. There are some things that can help us with the unknown unknowns. So getting people together, having conversation. And I put it to you, as you may remember from the very beginning, the first slide, that conversation is an important element in our armory of creating and harvesting intelligence or knowledge. So whether we use systems to improve workflow or project management, the sorts of decisions that we need to take on an operational basis, or we use document management systems, maybe intranets, to manage our content and our collaboration. We might also use some fairly clever modern technologies, like at the moment we're using a kind of web conferencing, we're using a WebEx analog. There are plenty of these systems and processes out there, but do they genuinely create knowledge? Do they genuinely facilitate in us keeping that knowledge and finding that knowledge? Sure, some of them do, but there are risks. Risks are, I'll go through a few of these just to highlight some that really resonate in my 25 years experience. First of all, the problem of build it and they will come. We say to our teams and our peers in organizations, look, there's a database, let's populate it. We've got this wonderful intranet, why don't we use it? Well, in most organizations, let's be honest, intranets are not effectively utilized. They're not utilized to their fullest extent for collaboration or sharing of knowledge. People don't get the what's in it for me, okay? So systems have to be personally relevant, and in many cases they are too generic or too irrelevant to be of any value to people. The content is what is important, not the container. And too many systems lack the maintenance to keep them going. Okay, so many an intranet, for example, will fall into disrepair because the content isn't routinely maintained. They start to lose that what's in it for me quality. People are the agents who create knowledge. It's people who have conversations. People develop relationships and trust. You can't do that between two systems. They're just bits and bytes. There are, of course, significant problems with cultural differences and time zones that don't need talking about. So all of these things together create obvious challenges for us if we look towards information technology as a solution. And my request to you in the competitive intelligence space is think carefully before you invest time and energy implementing any kind of system in the belief that it will create intelligence or it will create knowledge. It doesn't do that. The challenges that I want to focus on today can be facilitated through a number of tools, and I'm just presenting a few of the very many tools and some systems that are available to us in the knowledge management space. So these might be person-to-person activities such as after-action reviews, project retrospects, learning before and during a project. So these are activities often dismissed as being fluffy or woolly. They're things where people get together and have a conversation about their project. But it's only by having informal moments during these conversations, whether they are structured around an after-action review or they are really informal, a sort of retrospective conversation about your project. It's only during and after these conversations that you discover where and why and how things went wrong. You can use methods or techniques such as organizational network analysis. And this has been talked about quite a lot, I think, in competitive intelligence circles. Some people call it social network analysis. It's pretty much the same thing. But looking at the relationships between people, between the subject matter experts, identifying isolated people, collective communities, agents of a connection between active communities, so that the so-called boundary spanners. There are some very nice tools available to us to help create very simple analyses of organizations or of systems. Then there's system-based activities such as effective taxonomy and metadata. These of themselves don't create knowledge, they don't particularly help to identify knowledge, but they do help us to harvest knowledge and they help us to organize knowledge. So any good system worth its money will have effective metadata and taxonomy. On the other side of the spectrum, you have what some people call the really, really fluffy activities such as knowledge cafes or narrative and anecdote. Please don't dismiss these. Telling stories is a critical part of the way we understand projects, the way we understand our competitors' activities. It's the way we turn somebody else's experiences into shareable knowledge, something that can transfer tacit knowledge from one person to another. To truly internalize and socialize somebody else's knowledge, you do need to tell a story. You need to appreciate somebody else's learning as a kind of narrative, or it won't be internalized. And we'll talk about that in just a few more moments when we look at some of the critical principles of transferring and sharing knowledge. So these are just a few of the knowledge tools that are available. They are by no means exhaustive, and much can be found about any one of these. They're worthy of a webinar in their own right, but I want to highlight some to you because I'm sure from the competitive intelligence perspective, they're also rather important. The thing that I want to focus on though as the feature of today's session is around eliciting, capturing and transferring knowledge. So this is highlighted because it's important in recognizing the unknowns in our organization, the 80% of knowledge that's already in our organizations, and effectively doing something with it. Because I put it to you that whilst we might have a lot of knowledge, we might have 80% of the knowledge we need. If we don't know it's there, if we can't elicit that knowledge or do something with it, it's completely useless. So to put that into a different perspective, I might know a lot about something. Okay, so my total knowledge is very difficult to articulate. It's very difficult to quantify. We can't say how much it is, but let's just imagine for today's conversation that I know something. It's quite a lot. What I can tell about that knowledge is very little in comparison. But what I can write down is even less. I might know a lot from my experiences. I might know a lot from the project that finished only yesterday, but I can only write down a little bit of that because it's degraded. My experience has degraded. As I articulate verbally, the knowledge is degrading. As I begin to write down, I'm being even more concise in the way that that is articulated. And by the time I tell a story and that knowledge then becomes transferred into somebody else's mind, there is very little of that original knowledge left. It's a very, very small proportion. And we need to bear this in mind as we have our conversations, as we look to share what is critical, what are the best ways of transferring that really important know-how and know-why, really at the inside of our total knowledge. Here's where our old friend Dave Snowden comes into view. He's talked about 7 principles or 7 heuristics of knowledge working, and these are developed from a philosopher in the 1950s by the name of Mihály Polanyi, a Hungarian chap. He talked about the challenges of assuming that knowledge is ubiquitous, but in fact it's not easily managed, it's not easily handled. For example, we can only volunteer knowledge. It can't be conscripted. So in the competitive intelligence world, we know that interviewing a competitor or a third party will yield some valuable insights, some valuable information, perhaps intelligence, about a competitor's activity, about something strategically interesting. But you won't get everything from that person because it may not be volunteered. On the other hand, if you sit somebody in a room in a convenient, convivial atmosphere, you give them time, space, and opportunity to talk about what they know, then, like most people, they will give more than they would otherwise. People like to talk about themselves. This is volunteering knowledge, volunteering information, intelligence, and so on. Then we only know what we know when we need to know it. This sounds a little bit odd, but when you think about it, it's actually very, very relevant, very obvious. At any given moment, we cannot possibly remember or articulate all the critical facts, everything that we've learned about a particular subject. But at the moment of real need, then we do. We know what we know at that moment. Our brains are full of intelligence, knowledge, of experiences, but obviously we're not going to regurgitate that at the drop of a pin. We need to have the right moment, and it's at that moment when we know what we need to know. The way we know things is not the way we report things. So this goes back to my comment on the previous slide, that as we articulate our experiences, we start to degrade the quality of what we know. Your interpretation of what I say is different from my real knowledge. And the last point builds on that, and this is quite a tongue twister, but it's a very nice one to entertain in management circles, that we will always know more than we can say, and we will always say more than we can write down. This is very, very important. It's I suppose the principle that stayed with me for the longest. The effort our organisations put into writing reports, analysts' reports, news clippings, and harvesting all that information, putting it into a database and creating all these whiz-bang functions to retrieve content. That content, the stuff that you have put into that database, is limited to the extreme in what the people originally knew. It's limited by vocabulary, by language, by culture, by interpretation. So you will always know more than you can say, and you will always say more than you can write down. The challenge is, how do we harvest all the knowledge that's available within the organisation? And to put this into context, way back in 2008, commentators in the energy sector were talking about the pending retirement of experts, engineers and so on in the oil and gas industry. So they foresaw that within 10 years, the majority of critical experts were approaching retirement. Yet still this year, 2014, if you search in Google or your favorite search engine for the Great Crew Change, you'll hear a lot of commentary about the loss of tacit knowledge from this very same sector. So it would appear that nothing much has happened. There are 3 key challenges here. Just because knowledge has been captured and stored, it doesn't mean that it will ever be found or used. Many retention processes capture only a small part, as we've seen from the 7 principles. They capture only a small part of what was originally known. And of course, the key factor here is that somebody leaving an organization is going to take a lot of their knowledge with them. So what I want to present in the next few slides, just very briefly, is something that you can do from a strategic perspective to harvest the knowledge that's within your organization as part of a knowledge retention and transfer program. I've seen variants of this in other organizations, so this is a sort of synthesis of those experiences. There is no one method that will work in all organizations, but the suggestions I put to you over the next few slides will work in most circumstances. It's a cycle, it's an ongoing process, as many of these things are, and it takes on board planning, having some organization in the first place, eliciting knowledge, transferring knowledge, socializing that knowledge back into the organization, keeping the knowledge in the organization, and then reusing it. So first of all, planning. A number of things we can introduce or implement into our organizations, whether they are a strategy or a process map, something to get us started, make sure we focus on what's really important. Because a message underlying all of this talk of knowledge retention or knowledge exploitation is that we're not going to be 100% perfect. We cannot possibly capture, retain, and utilize 100% of what's available in our experts or in our culture. But there are things we can do at the outset and things that we should be doing routinely. So risk mapping our experts, looking at demographic profiles. This is what the energy sector did. They could see that people were coming up to retirement. It's a little bit sensitive, perhaps. You don't have to be explicit to the person, but there are things that you can do that are quite legitimate to risk map your demographic profile. Do you maintain registers of subject matter experts? Do you have a strategic succession plan? In other words, do you have a way of knowing what is the most important priority? Should somebody be 10 years, 3 years, or 1 year away from retirement? And then looking at eliciting knowledge. Well, this is such a huge subject and it's very, very subjective. I just want to share with you a couple of points here. One is, yes, you will do some sort of knowledge elicitation interview. There are many techniques for this, and I'm sure in the competitive intelligence world you're familiar with some of them. Think back to this principle that people like to talk about themselves. Knowledge can only be volunteered. If you give people the opportunity, then they will talk about themselves. Consider capturing lessons learned, not as a one-off activity, not when somebody's just 3 months away from retiring, but as a routine activity. Tell stories. Tell stories as a social activity. Make it informal, but don't dismiss it, please, as wasting time. It's not. It's a valuable way of eliciting and transferring knowledge within your organization. The tools that you need, the systems, the equipment is very simple. It's very basic. So I've used in a number of scenarios an iPhone or a very simple video device, a dictaphone, plenty of flip charts, post-it notes, pens, and the usual paraphernalia you would get in an office. The main thing is to have somebody who volunteers, a willing subject, the right atmosphere, and the time to do this, so it's not a last-minute activity. Transferring knowledge from one person to another person, so to a recipient of that knowledge, is all very good, but don't just transfer it to one person, because that's just transferring the risk. That person will also leave at some point. So think about maybe some short-term assignments, relocating people, expert buddying or job sharing. These things are not difficult to achieve, and many organizations have the capacity and the scale to do this. We've mentioned storytelling and lessons learned already, so informal ways of sharing what we know, but look to exploit your communities of practice. Look at your collaborative behaviours. You might be an organisation, for example, in the consulting sector or in an R&D environment where you would expect collaboration to be the norm. But is it truly a collaborative environment, or are people hoarding knowledge? And then there are some great ways of having spontaneous or organised sessions to share knowledge, share learnings with other people. Lunch and learns, knowledge fairs, and audience with many, many ways you can get people together. But then look to socialise that knowledge. This is often the forgotten factor. People stop their knowledge transfer activities when they put content into a database, when they've held a transfer meeting. It doesn't stop there. It continues. So socialise your knowledge, again, through working with others, developing your collaborative behaviours, and having these ad hoc meetings. Make sure you keep your knowledge. Keep knowledge not only by keeping the people where you can, but focusing on the networks, focusing on the systems you do use being really accessible, and look to build on core tacit knowledge by developing case studies or a book of tacit knowledge. It's something that really encapsulates core critical knowledge. So we've looked at, I guess, the most critical part of knowledge management in organisations from the perspective of how do we retain and transfer knowledge. But what are you going to do in your organisation? There are a few things to say, just a couple more slides to share with you before we pause for some questions. First of all, I want to put it to you that, in fact, knowledge management itself is not difficult. Intellectually, it's very, very straightforward. The challenge for us, the challenge for any organisation, is that knowledge sharing is an unnatural act. Changing behaviour is the biggest challenge. Changing behaviour in any organisation is a challenge. How are you going to do it? Some things just to highlight, and these are true in any organisation. Knowledge management is not a quick fix. It doesn't take a year, it takes 10 years in some cases to fully develop a knowledge management program that is successful. You will go through many iterations. It might be through stealth, it might be through design, but it will take time and you will eventually get there. Knowledge management outcomes can't be replicated. So you might find some great best practices from other organizations, but you can't simply plug them in to your organization. Similarly, you can't buy a knowledge management solution. Of course, you can buy the technologies, but you can't make knowledge happen. It has to be people. Building on that, people can't be manipulated to do KM. If they don't want to, they're not going to do it. It doesn't come with an IT solution, as we've seen, and it doesn't always come with a tangible return on investment. So throughout all of this, whatever your approach to knowledge management, whether it's to build on technologies you've already got, whether it's to develop your communities of practice, my recommendation is look to understand what you already know. Exploit what you know. Exploit the known knowns. Make those more efficient. But consider ways of understanding the unknown unknowns, because that is where you'll find most often the real gems, the solutions to many of the problems you've got. So I've spoken for about 35 minutes or so. I think I'll pause there and perhaps we can take some questions. Rainer, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you very much. This was very interesting, and actually nobody dropped out, so I guess for everybody in our webinar it was very interesting. Yeah, please send your questions via the chat function. I received already some, and we can simply take it from there, but keep on piling your questions. Here's a question for you, Jonathan. How should a CI manager provide incentives for colleagues to actively collect sensitive information? Obviously, the term sensitive refers to nothing you usually share. So there seems to be a little bit of well, a twist here. Any advice on that?
I think there's a spectrum here of what is sensitive. So at some level, all knowledge or intelligence is sensitive to somebody. Most people, given the opportunity, will naturally want to hoard knowledge, and there are things we should think about incentivizing them to give up their knowledge. But if they think it's truly sensitive, is it confidential for some reason? Of course, your organization might have policies. I worked in an organization that has very strict policies around managing intellectual property, to the extent that very little active sharing happens. But presenting the opportunity that innovation happens through sharing ideas, innovation only happens through developing what we already know. In fact, there is a maxim in knowledge management that says we only learn by making mistakes. In other words, by recognizing that sensitive information or confidential knowledge doesn't just sit in isolation, it's part of the broader awareness of our organization. I think the intelligent people do recognize
I'm sure of that.
How or when to build on that.
But I think the question here is pretty much into this incentives topic. So in general, would you recommend to provide incentives for sharing information? And in
Yes.
the special case, would it work there as well, or do you have a different way of elicitation, of getting people to this, well, more sensitive exchange of information? Again, talking not about espionage here, but more the kind of, maybe I don't want to be known that I've been the one who provided this bit of information throughout my organization. So any policy, any idea or best practice that you can share with us here?
Well, not specifically around sensitive information as such, but if we treat any kind of information and you want your colleagues to share more actively, then organizations that have been very successful in incentivizing, organizations like Lloyd's Register in London, ConocoPhillips, the big oil giant, or Schlumberger, the geosciences company, they succeeded, I think, in providing personal incentives. So whether that's recognition on a ladder of number of contributions to a wiki, number of active participations in a community of practice, or to the leaders and coordinators of communities of practice who have a significant role in encouraging their peers to talk about their experiences, to actively share. We do see those sort of activities happening.
Okay.
Of course, comments can be made anonymously. There's no reason why you can't do that, but I would hesitate about that, because I think it creates the wrong environment. You do want people to acknowledge the responsibility they have in an organization, to share what is needed, to share what is critical. And if they think the only way they can do it is by being anonymous, then I think you start to create opportunity for rumours, scandalous comments, things that aren't really important, the sort of noise.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty challenging topic, I have to admit. Okay, but let's go for the next question. I think you pretty much answered the first one. Do you know about any scientific research that has been into the impact of social media on knowledge management in organization? I guess the question is pretty much, are we now all into sharing more and more information? Is it easier for corporations to set up systems like that, given that everybody is running around with mobile devices and it's all over connected?
Yeah.
Any advice on that or research on that people can pick and present?
It's a great question, and I wish I had a percentage number to give to you, some specific scientific research, what you will find, Rainer, is a lot of commentary from the protagonists of social media and the people who are adopting social media, that these are the tools and the methods that we should be adopting. And they give all sorts of headline numbers. Often these are marketing figures, evidence from the salespeople that we should buy their tools. And I've been asked many times, what's the social media policy? What social tools are we using in a particular organization? There is, I have to say, in all honesty, probably hard evidence. I haven't seen the scientific evidence that social media in themselves contribute to particularly enhanced exploitation of knowledge. I'm excluding here, I suppose, the relatively well-used, well-recognized tools such as wikis, intranets, the old chat forums of the past. I think we've moved beyond those in the social media space. So we do see notable success in exemplary organizations in using wiki technology. Again, whether that's been scientifically interpreted, I don't know, but there are some very good case studies out there.
Yeah. I have to,
some of these social media.
I have to admit I couldn't quote any research either, but I'm not really into that, to be honest. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks, fair enough. On slide 22, there's a question for knowledge elicitation. Maybe you just want to click to 22. Simply asking for some advice on literature for these elicitation interview techniques. Anything comes to your mind?
There is one that I'm just trying to think of the name off the top of my head. Give me a couple of seconds. It's about ethnographic interviews, which is a great book, many years old, so it predates a lot of the technology, that talks about ways of asking the right question, creating the right environment in which somebody is comfortable giving a response and how to interpret that response. Because the challenge here is, on the one hand, the volunteerism, and secondly, at the other end, receiving that intelligence or that wisdom from somebody. How do you interpret it? So I'm just having a momentary lapse of memory in remembering the name of the ethnographic interview book. It's a great one.
Yeah, I'm sure it will come back, and you can definitely send it over and we pass it to our audience.
The other technique I would just like to mention, Rainer, for a few seconds, is a technique called MASK, M-A-S-K, and there is literature. If you search your favorite search engine like Google, you'll find references to the method for analyzing and structuring knowledge. It's a French method. Some of the references will be in French, but they talk about a particular technique for elicitation. Again, adopting some of Dave Snowden's principles. Look that up on the internet.
Okay.
M-A-S-K, mask.
Okay, that's noted. Then the next question. Are there any tools/methodologies around to learn knowledge management? So not to be confused with your knowledge tools that you presented, but here it's more the education training path.
I think that's woefully lacking, unfortunately. So there are training events, there are the usual academic courses and so on. But I suppose
I think the question is more into, if I'm now a CI manager and want to get my salespeople to become better at knowledge management, how should I train them hands-on, pragmatic, and really get them to new height in terms of sharing information?
Yeah. Well, I think in the spirit of what knowledge management's about, it's doing it, learning from experience. So depending on your strategy, whether you have a stealth approach to implementing some a change agenda, whether you have some challenges around retaining knowledge or transferring knowledge. Bring your key people, your knowledge workers into the project, set them challenges to get involved in the communities of practice, try out some of these knowledge elicitation techniques. It's the practice that develops the learning. It's the learning that comes from doing the knowledge management. I really don't think there are any very useful tools other than the hands-on experience.
Mm-hmm.
Unless, of course, anyone else has any ideas out there. I'm very, very interested to learn.
Yeah, please use the chat function if anybody volunteers and wants to step in. We're here to share knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Okay. While we're waiting, on slide 14, if you can just click a few slides back, you had this narrative and anecdotal tools.
Yep.
Here's a question. Is this storytelling as a methodology, and how does it work?
Yes, it is storytelling. So people call it narrative, people call it storytelling. It's not, standing in front of somebody in the corridor and sharing an anecdote. That's a short quip. That is an anecdote. Storytelling is a much richer experience of having a theme you want to explore. Again, giving somebody or a group of peer people the opportunity, the space, the time, the permission to talk about their real experiences. A little comment you may not have seen on this slide talks about best and worst practices. And I think something many organisations overlook, many people overlook, is the need or the willingness to talk about things that haven't worked, things that have gone wrong. So storytelling works by giving somebody or a group of people the permission to talk confidently, openly about things that haven't worked, to describe not only this what we did 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but why we did something. What was the thought process? What was the decision making? Again, it is totally independent of technology. It doesn't need any database or system to do this. The behaviours of the people involved, the participants, the room, the setting, the space, the time, the belief that these people can talk about things that haven't worked, and a focused topic are the most critical.
Okay, I think that's it pretty much. Yeah, there are no other questions in my chat window, so I think we're pretty much done. If you could go to the very last slide. And then it's up to us to thank our audience and hope it was useful and something that made you really think about this knowledge sharing idea, and of course our link to competitive intelligence. As I mentioned in the very, very beginning, there is a Competitive Intelligence Insight Center on our website where you will find sooner or later this webinar as well as some others, so please check them out. If you feel there is more need to meet Jonathan and learn more about knowledge management, here's a workshop mentioned September 14th, actually it should be not the 4th, in London, where we run our ICI 3.8, so any questions about that, please let me know. And yes, there is next year our international conference already in the making. We just finished our call for speakers and I'm now into evaluation assessment. I can promise this will be a very interesting event. And yes, here are the contact details of Jonathan. So if you have any questions or request some more literature or any other advice, please feel free to contact him. And I'm sure you'll get some straight answers as well. Anything from you? Final last words, Jonathan?
Oh, well, just to say thank you very much indeed, Rainer, for the opportunity and to thank everyone for their participation. I just want to leave on a parting thought. knowledge management is a huge, huge topic. It's absolutely vast. What I've shared with you today are just a few little insights to get you thinking around this subject. I wish all of you big success if you develop knowledge management in your organisations. I believe it's critical. Do please share your experiences and look up the workshop and the conference, as Rainer said. So thank you very much.
Yes, so thanks a lot and goodbye to everybody.